Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the University of Toronto and the Center for Jewish Studies. It is a great pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful opportunity to see old friends, if I may say, old friends, new friends, former students, and people I corresponded with but now see in person. There is a little bit of a pressure on me this time because I'm not the only Weissberg in the room. My cousin is sitting over there, and that's probably going to be the hardest critic of today, but I have to take the risk. The paper today is one of a series of papers that I wrote in response to an award I received a couple of years ago from the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation. So it will deal with questions of Holocaust testimonies. I begin. First, the witness of God and the witness at court. Is that okay with the microphone? Closer. Is that okay? Okay, because I can't hear that. A witness takes his stand. His physical presence supports his statement. Nothing that he says, by the way, I call the witness a he, you can change it into a she, a they, and so on. Nothing that he says relies on hearsay or is based on mediated sources. He himself has seen or experienced all that he will talk about. He addresses the court. He confirms the truth of his statement in the here and now. Testimony such as this does not only involve a person who speaks, but also one who listens, and who will either accept what he hears or reject it as unconvincing. The witness delivers the account of a subjective experience that should contribute to an objective narrative, and thus the individual perspective of witnesses will turn into a generally accepted, verifiable testimony. The witness's statement will contribute to establish truth. But what kind of truth is this? Already in the Old Testament, an important witness appears who would like to offer testimony. Moses ascends the mountain of Sinai, and although he cannot see God himself, he recognizes him as the ultimate power. Moses receives the 10 Commandments that would become the law for the newly formed people of Israel. Thus, he becomes a witness on behalf of God, but also confirms the existence of the chosen people. Henceforth, Moses' physical looks would mirror his encounter with God. After his return from Mount Sinai, his appearance itself turns into testimony. Moses' face is lit by a light of glorification which medieval and early modern artists, such as Michelangelo, for example, would greatly misunderstand because they would produce images that do not reflect rays of light, but picture horns. In the book Isaiah in the Bible, God himself is made to speak. I quote, "You are my witnesses," he declares, "and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he." Paradoxically, witnesses are necessary because this one and only God chose to remain invisible. Unlike the God of the heathens, this God hides himself from the human beings whom he created. Moses is no witness of what he has seen, but stands for the unseen. Just like Moses, every Jew should, indeed has to, become a witness of this God, just as the followers of some branches of the later Christian faith would regard themselves as witnesses too. Members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, demonstrate this already in their name. The act of witnesses is located at the center of religious thought. And the idea that a person could become a witness already through and with his bodily presence and his choice of faith is not restricted to the Hebrew Bible, but also reflected in an ancient Greek word. The Greek word for witness is martyr or blood witness. Until today, every Jew who follows the daily prayer of Hear Israel, Shema Israel, offers a confirmation of his faith and a loyalty to his people by turning at the same time into a witness of God. But in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, witnessing in the sense of religious confirmation is also linked with the demand of acting lawfully. Religion and law are bound together tightly. Thus, we read in the 3rd book of Moses, I quote, "And if anyone sin, in that he heareth the voice of adoration, he being a witness, whether he hath seen or known, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his inquiry. A witness has the duty to take a stand, and it is prohibited to utter falsehood. To arrive at a just decision and a just judgment, a multiplication of witnesses is advised, moreover. At least 2 witnesses should be asked to speak up. I quote, "One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity, or for any sin. In any sin he sinneth. At the mouth of 2 witnesses, or at the mouth of 3 witnesses, shall a matter be established." The Latin word for witness is testis, and the minimum number of 2 witnesses and 2 witness testimonies was established by Roman law. Unus testis, nullus testis. 1 witness is no witness. Many centuries later, this ruling had also been adopted by the legal system of the German Reich and other states. As a consequence, witnesses called upon can support different views and issue conflicting statements. The secular legal process at court had succeeded the court of God, as well as the authoritarian verdict offered by a single ruler. And here too, multiple perspectives become the fundamental condition of a system that does not want anything else but a single verdict and a clear result. If somebody has been called to the witness stand, moreover, he cannot decline to do so. This duty of witnesses is already inscribed in the German word Zeuge, which derives from the word ziehen, to draw or drag. As a witness, a person is obliged by law to go to court and has to be drawn there. The Latin word testis differs from the Greek martyr as blood witness, as it does not only refer to a person, but also to a process, or at least a procedure, that would serve the discovery of truth. Next to the prosecutor and the defendant, the witness as testis is the 3rd, or tertius, necessary for any trial and the determination of truth. The witness and his testimony, the representative and the content of any statement depend on each other, but may also be considered as being different from each other. Unlike Moses' case, the body of the witness does no longer serve as the sign of truth, however. And although witnesses who cannot but state their subjective experiences may prove to be the most unreliable persons in a court trial, the court will regard their statements as especially important. A defendant can decline to make any statement, for example, and this will have no legal consequences for him. The Fifth Amendment in the American legal system protects the defendant from self-incrimination. he is protected by law. A witness, on the other hand, is not only forced to take stand, he has also to swear an oath to say the truth and nothing but the truth. If the witness statement is false, he will have committed a crime and can be persecuted for perjury. In the religious context, the presence of the person who is a witness is important. In the legal context, the truth of the statement matters, and this truth has to be supported by the credibility of the person who provides testimony. Besides martyr and testis, however, there is a third kind of witness and witnessing, however, that will become the focus of the following remarks. It is the so-called superstes. It means a person who has survived a catastrophe and would like to provide an account of it. Secondly, the Holocaust survivor as witness. A survivor of a catastrophe can also provide testimony for what had happened. But his testimony has to be a quite different one. It can provoke what the literary critic and psychoanalyst Shoshana Fellman would call a crisis of witnessing. Such a survivor could, for example, confirm his physical survival by coming forth and speaking out. But it would be more difficult for him, for sure, to describe the events that he had survived. In his study of Maurice Blanchot of 1998, the philosopher Jacques Derrida would explore the phenomenon of witnessing and identify the secret, as the central notion and idea of witnessing. According to Derrida, a witness has to tell what the public does not know, and at the same time, he generates his testimony from whatever has not been articulated yet. The witness offers up a secret, but paradoxically he will safeguard it as well. In 1991, a few years before Derrida's essay appeared in print, Fellman would publish a long discussion of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. Lanzmann's Shoah, a film of more than 9 hours running time, was released in 1985, and it was based on interviews with survivors, perpetrators, and bystanders that the director conducted over more than a decade. In analyzing the film's witness reports, and in particularly those of survivors, Fellman follows a similar argument as Derrida. But for Fellman, the so-called crisis in witnessing is not the result of a postulated secret or something that could be silenced or should be silenced or become a secret. At the root of the crisis is the simple fact that survivors cannot assume the position of a witness at all. As the goal of the final solution was the elimination of all Jews, any survivor would have to have escaped this goal. They had escaped death and were still alive. They are unable to describe the final solution. For Fellman, the Holocaust, therefore, is an event that is unable to produce witnesses. Fellman refers in her argument to the Italian writer Primo Levi, who had survived internment in Auschwitz and whose novels and reports would assume the character of witness testimonies. And indeed, Levi had already very early questioned the role of the survivor as a witness. In his study of 1986, The Drowned and the Saved, Levi points at the radical center of the Holocaust, the destruction of all human life in the concentration camps in the name of the final solution. I quote Levi. I want to repeat, not we, the survivors, are the true witnesses. We survivors are an abnormal and small minority. We are those who have not touched the ground, either because of misuse or ability or simply luck. But whoever has done that, who has seen the Gorgon, has not returned to tell his story, or he returned silenced. Only those, the Muselmänner perhaps, the drowned ones, are the complete witnesses whose testimony could have any general significance. Levy implies that the true, as he writes, the complete witness would be that who had experienced the inside of the gas chambers only. But if he would confirm the success of the crimes, he would no longer be alive and come forth as a witness. Only the so-called Muselmänner, perhaps, would be able to witness and offer an inkling of the experience of death. In Auschwitz, prisoners who had given up on life and ceased to think and feel as human beings were called Muselmänner. These were the walking dead, who were not technically dead yet. In the third volume of his series Homo Sacer, published in 1998, Giorgio Agamben turns to Levy as well. In his essay, What Remains of Auschwitz, the Archive and the Witness, he refers to Levy, and Agamben too describes the Muselmann as the only possible living witness of the Holocaust. But the differences between Fellman, who has stated the general impossibility of witnessing the Holocaust, and Levy and Agamben, who are considering the Muselmann as a possible witness, may be simply of a theoretical nature. None of those living dead would actually survive the war and the concentration camps to be able to tell their stories, if only in silence. All surviving camp inmates have been able in general, of course, to talk about their experiences of persecution and of suffering, but their reports include many gaps or Leerstellen. The survivors are those who got away, and their narratives had to embed the loss of their families and friends, and also their own fear of death. In the end, they are not so much witnesses of the final solution as of the project's failure. Their living bodies are the evidence of a persecution that did not reach its desired end, an evidence of the luck and accident, ruse and betrayal that could work on their behalf. But there is also a further historical gap that all of these survivors share that does not relate to their experiences with near death or the fear of death, but with the specific nature of the Holocaust itself. The aim of the National Socialists was not just the destruction of life deemed to be unworthy. It was also the destruction of all traces of the project as it proceeded. The Jews, as well as the events of the final solution, were to be made to disappear. The concentration camp Dachau was established already in 1933 as a very visible complex for the internment of political prisoners, and soon for representatives of the Catholic Church as well, who refused to follow party line. Dachau was supposed to serve as a deterrent and warning for the general German population. Later concentration camps, however, were established mostly in Eastern Europe. They were not just prisons or slave camps, but also from 1943 on, death camps. Their placement was not marked on any maps, and their location and workings were kept secret. The purpose of the deportation of Jews was mostly camouflaged as well. Jews were collected to be sent to the East for so-called resettlement or for work. In the last month of World War II, the National Socialists did not only proceed with the elimination of Jews, but also in great measure with the elimination of all evidence of murder. Documents were destroyed, camps dismantled, inmates sent on death marches, and already buried corpses were disinterred to be burned. The mass murder was to take place under cover, and all traces of it were to be erased as well. the final solution did not only aim to set an end to Europe's Jewish population. With the exception of a few museum projects, the National Socialists aimed to show that mostly Jews did not exist at all. Nevertheless, the knowledge of the goal of the persecution and final solution, and of details relating or leading to both, has been the driving force for individuals who tried to survive, and has become fundamental in the self-understanding of survivors after World War II. In their reports, a further and third gap or Leerstelle would become noticeable. Survivors were victims and traumatized by the events of the past. As a result of their experiences, they could not talk much about their traumas, but their traumas defined their reports and their linguistic testimonies, as well as their gestures, behavior, and everything that would reflect their memories of event. Psychoanalysts such as Dori Laub or psychoanalytically oriented literary critics such as Kathy Carruth viewed the statements of the survivors as a crisis of witnesses of another sort then, as paradigmatic examples for the research on trauma. One may not be able to answer whether the survivors' statements are marked by trauma, or if that trauma would move thus in the position of the secret that Derrida had written about. Or trauma would become apparent in the narrative and in the very language of the witness during the performance of witnessing. With this consideration, witnessing has received another significance as well. The statements of survivors are not only evidence of the traumatization, but formed a kind of therapy as well. The invitation to take the witness stand is an invitation to language, to a however discontinuous narrative, and perhaps a working out of trauma as well. In this light, becoming witness may be a kind of therapeutical necessity, and the therapeutical aspect of witnessing rests on the performative nature and its insistence on being a linguistic event. Despite their inherent impossibility, witness reports of the Holocaust survivors insist on as a moral necessity, also working against the denial of events, forgetting, or the erasure of material traces. But in contrast to other witness statements at court, factual truth in the most rigid and in the most narrow and rigid sense cannot be expected here. Fellman describes the statements of victims who are featured in Lanzmann's film as multi-perspectival or as examples of fragmentation. In Shoah, the Holocaust does not only appear as an event that tried to erase witnesses as well as testimony, but as one that cannot be captured in a simple and unified view. I cite Fellman. As a philosophical inquiry into the ungraspability of difference and as a narrative of the specific differences between the various witnesses, Shoah, the film, implies a fragmentation of the testimonies, a fragmentation both of tongues and of perspectives that cannot ultimately be surpassed. It is because the film goes from singular to singular, because there is no possible representation of one witness by the other, that Lanzmann needs us to sit through 10 hours of the film to begin to witness, to begin to have a concrete sense both of our own ignorance and of the incommensurability of the occurrence. The occurrence is conveyed precisely by the fragmentation of testimonies, which enact the fragmentation of witnessing. In other words, there cannot be a real community of witnesses who agree. But even if the witnesses' statements cannot convey a factual truth that can be proven, and even if no individual statement can be generalized or even often brought in line with others, survivors' testimony relate truth of another kind. One can call it perhaps emotional truth. A survivor may describe 10 chimneys attached to incinerators at a specific concentration camp. An historian may reject this statement. For the historian, evidence of only 2 chimneys may exist. But the survivor who had been an inmate in this concentration camp and who has seen the chimney in action noticed something else than the mere number. For him, the sky was red and the whole world was aflames. In regard to the survivor witnesses, the viewer or listener takes on a unique role as well. He is and he is not the official point of address. And just as in the religious witness reports, the survivor guarantees the truth of his statement with his bodily presence. Unlike legal testimony, the act of witnessing, the narrative itself, seems to be more important than the statement of specific facts. In listening to a witness account, the listener does not become a recipient of factual knowledge as much as a secondary witness of sorts, who we feel connected to the primary one and experience compassion. The survivor's trauma is passed on to him in a limited way. It is a kind of transference, a process that resembles psychoanalytic experience rather than legal one. Thirdly, to offer testimony. In the past 30 years, witness accounts from survivors were documented on an increasingly large scale on video and film. Public as well as private institutions have served as sponsors for these collections, many of which have been transferred into digital format recently. 2 collections are particularly prominent, and both have their primary location in the United States. The Fortunov Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University was established in 1979 by Laub and the literary critic Jeffrey Hartman. Fellman has worked with the material. The Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive at the University of Southern California was founded in 1994 by the film director Steven Spielberg and is today the largest archive of its kind. It includes more than 54,000 interviews of survivors. In the last couple of decades, there has been a strong desire to hear such testimony in whatever shape. The film Shoah is screened in classrooms, for example, if only in excerpts. Survivors have been visiting school classes to speak to students and talked in churches and on television. Doron Rabinovich and Matthias Hartmann's play Die letzten Zeugen, The Last Witnesses, first produced in Vienna on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, has put survivors themselves as actors on stage. The desire to hear survivors' testimony seems to have increased as the natural lifespan of these survivors is coming to an end. But Holocaust testimonies were also documented shortly after the war ended. At the time of liberation of the concentration camps, however, this testimony was not sought by listening to survivors' accounts, but by presenting the visible bodies of the survivors only as evidence of the crimes. Images of survivors accompanied the documentation of the military victory of the Allies in newsreels and newspaper reportage, even before the war had ended officially. The military powers wanted to document destroyed cities and towns, but also the victims of the National Socialist system. Film and photography was put into place right at the beginning. And the liberation of concentration camps was accompanied by camera work. The Allied army personnel that entered the camps in 1944 and 1945 were the first who would see the scenes of horror as outsiders of the systems. Not the survivors were viewed as witnesses, however, and neither were the captured camp guards or the German soldiers or the bystanders. Only the liberators were to tell the stories. They were to testify and describe what they had discovered and what was known at the time. The word Holocaust itself was not coined yet. They were to testify the liberation of the camps. Members of the Russian, English, French, or American armies and the associated military forces, Canadian, may have had different political agendas, but the liberation of the camps was documented by all in documentary images. The officers of the Soviet army passed on photo and film cameras to their soldiers, who were to celebrate the victory over the enemy with this documentation. The images were then disseminated in the Soviet Union and the times beyond. The Russians were the first allies who stumbled upon the camps while moving westwards. Their film material was integrated into a larger narrative of the victory over fascism. Soviet film and photographic material was rendered in black and white, and besides documenting the camp, the soldiers took pictures of the roads that led to the camp, of burned fields, destroyed houses, and a demoralized German population. Professional film directors and photographers were embedded in the American army. You can see the great difference in quality when you watch the films. And they made films of the liberation of the camps as well. Some of the directors, such as George C. Stevens, had already gathered experience in Hollywood studios. Established photographers, even female photographers such as Margaret Burke White or Lee Miller, joined army divisions, and they too documented the liberation of the camps. Back in the United States, in turn, film directors such as Billy Wilder oversaw the production of news material that would be screened for a wider use in the United States. These newsreels were to inform, to justify the American war effort, and to celebrate the Army's achievements. In the course of this, the American Army was also experimenting with new technology. Several of the films made about the liberation of the concentration camps used new color technology. Kodak was at the forefront of the liberation. Thus, the early filming of the camps became a media experiment as well, offering experience for further use in a widely different context. But the Americans did not only look at the soldiers who would liberate the camps as witnesses. They were seeking further witnesses as well. Representatives of the American Senate were hurriedly flown to Germany to inspect the camps. The survivors found had already received early medical treatment, but dead bodies were not all secured and buried yet. Films reported the visits of General Dwight D. Eisenhower and other politicians, and this too was to be screened for a wider audience back home. And there was another group of witnesses that was called upon still. As part of an educational program initiated by the American Army, German citizens and residents of villages and towns neighboring the camps were brought to the sites. They were to see the conditions of the camps, the corpses found, as well as the survivors rescued, and to contemplate the consequences of National Socialist ideology. This pedagogical effort was filmed in turn as well and cut as a newsreel item for distribution. Thus, the number of witnesses and their perspectives multiplied, but also that which should be witnessed. There was the Holocaust, the liberation, the reaction to the liberation. all these eyewitnesses were fixed on film in turn, making the media itself part of the testimony. These films were then introduced into the Nuremberg trials, which were trials allowing film as evidence. The photographs were silent, but in none of the films the survivors were made to speak either. Indeed, only one voice was audible in all of these films, the male voice of the narrator, who would provide a commentary to the images shown. At the beginning of many American newsreels, a document was featured that provided a declaration under oath on behalf of the truth of the images that would follow. The document testified for the veracity of the images. The Soviet films proceeded differently. Often a Soviet general would be featured at the beginning of the film. He would appear in full uniform and sport a great number of medals. Symbolically, the general's dress and medals were to certify the authenticity of the subsequent images. Victims only appeared as corpses or as silent bodies. These newsreels would perhaps not show Muselmänner, but feature survivors rendered as Muselmänner. The National Socialist regime had dehumanized human beings and rendered them as objects, but the films made by the Allies did not proceed differently. Survivors were shown as people without agency, unable to render any statements themselves. And soon, the photographs made in and of the individual camps would become totally interchangeable, just as victims did not appear to have any names or individual identities. Newspapers and journals printed stock pictures of concentration camps that could stand for any of them, exchanging the name of the camps in the caption as well. So the same picture would be in one newspaper, Dachau, in the next newspaper, Auschwitz, and so on. This did not correspond to the actual events. Already shortly after liberation, many survivors had taken on own initiative. They began to document their experiences, began to collect material, began to offer interviews to each other, began to write their life stories and memoirs. In 1944, after the liberation of Polish territory by the Soviet army, not yet the end of the war, Philip Friedman, a Polish Jewish survivor, initiated a historical commission in Łódź. Further commissions of this kind were founded by survivors in Paris and Munich in 1945. Thus, the first experiences and details regarding various concentration and death camps were documented, questionnaires distributed and filled out. But around 1950, all of these projects were discontinued. Most of the Jewish historians and interviewers, as well as the survivors to be interviewed, had decided to leave Europe and were at least planning to do so. But there was one scholar who traveled to Europe to provide documentation. In 1946, the linguist and psychologist David Boder, a lecturer at the Illinois Institute of Technology in the United States, ventured to Paris and occupied Germany. He had an early wire recorder in his luggage. He set out to record voices with the help of steel wires. Boder had seen these silent pictures in the newsreels and wanted to make the survivors' voices audible. He worked on a scientific study on the behavior of Jewish victims during the time of persecution. Boder was Jewish himself, and he hailed originally from Riga. His studies and his emigration led him to many European countries as well as Mexico. As a linguist, he could conduct interviews in German, French, Yiddish, Spanish, English, and several Slavic languages. And therefore he had an advantage over the Allied soldiers, who could hardly communicate with the victims at all and were dependent on translators. In regard to their length, Boder's interviews were dependent on the size of the steel wires and the number that he brought with him. The interviews themselves would show the awkwardness of a questioner who had no real grasp of the historical events yet. Not too much was known about the persecution of Jews yet. So some of his interviews started with a young woman from Vienna. "Oh, you're from Vienna, you must know my friend so-and-so," and so on. "Are you a good smoker? Do you like the..." So, you know, this was a little bit awkward. After his return to Illinois, Border published a few excerpts of his interviews and compiled a few statistics for his scholarly work. That was all. By 1948, the political situation in Europe had changed radically. The now much smaller German territory would be divided into two different states. The efforts to rebuild these two new states were now viewed as more important than the exploration, documentation, and working out of the recent events. It was the time of the Cold War. Until 1955, Austria was divided into zones of occupation, but the erstwhile allies were now regarding themselves as enemies. In Germany, one state assumed a hostile position towards the other. For the West, it was not fascism that provided a sense of immediate danger, but communism. Communism had become the new enemy. Indeed, the post-war years were often described as a period of silence, a time during which even survivors did not want to put down their stories, but simply tried to go on with their lives and invent themselves anew. But this, too, is not quite correct. Many survivors were writing memoirs and were eager to give testimonies, but often they were doing this in languages other than those spoken in their new places of residence. These manuscripts did not reach the readers. They were not translated and printed. For publishing houses in the West or the East, moreover, the Holocaust constituted a rather unpopular topic that could not justify the efforts of publication. Only one text received great and even extraordinary early acclaim, the Diary of Anne Frank. It appeared in a shorter and censored form in 1947, already as Het Achterhuis in Amsterdam. By the 1950s, Frank's diary was already translated in more than 70 languages. The text was rendered as a theater play as well, which has become popular on the American stage and received the Pulitzer Prize. George Stevens, the filmmaker who had filmed the liberation of the concentration camps, directed the film version of this play. It was released in 1959, and in the following year, the film was awarded 3 Oscars. Anne Frank, who did not survive the war, would turn into a symbolic voice for all victims. Her story seemed to make all other testimony superfluous. Fourth, the Eichmann trial. A spectacular event and trial would elicit new interest in the testimony of Holocaust survivors. In 1960, Adolf Eichmann, the person presumed to be responsible for the plan and enforcement of the final solution, was captured by agents of the Israeli Secret Service Mossad in Argentina. He was interviewed in Argentina first, then brought to Jerusalem. In the following year, he had to stand trial there. Eichmann had become an emblematic figure at that point, not only for the history of the persecution of Jews during the Third Reich, but also for German post-war history and the United States dealing with Nazi perpetrators. The West Germans, as well as the American Secret Service, had already been well aware of the fact that Eichmann had assumed a false name after the war, had lived in the Lüneburger Heide in Germany freely, and then fled to Argentina. In Buenos Aires, he assumed the name Ricardo Clement and a position in the Mercedes automobile factory. He had also managed to send for his family to join him there. Neither the young Federal Republic of Germany nor the United States were eager to risk a trial against Eichmann, though. People in the government in both states were afraid that Eichmann, once captured, would be able to name names, point at former National Socialists who had meanwhile assumed positions in the American CIA, working in Cold War efforts against the Soviet Union, or in scientific institutions, think of Werner von Braun, or had assumed prominent positions in politics of business in West Germany. For example, Eichmann could have offered information concerning Hans Globke, the close advisor to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. During the Third Reich, Globke served as the co-author of the regime's racial laws. Globke had become a member of the conservative CDU party after the war, and his political career continued smoothly. Adenauer and others were aware of his past, but decided to keep silent. But in 1957, the Hessian state prosecutor, Fritz Bauer, received information from an Argentinian informant who would identify Eichmann as the father of his daughter's friend. Bauer deemed his informant to be believable, but feared that the BND, West Germany's secret service, knew about Eichmann's whereabouts already and was not eager to demand his deportation and bring him to trial in Germany. Thus, Bauer arranged for a fake break-in to his office to offer material he collected to Israeli agents of the Mossad. He hoped that Eichmann could be brought to trial in this way. Bauer was eager to persecute Nazi criminals. A few years later, he would prepare and be in charge of the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt. Bauer expected the Israelis to act differently. For the new Jewish state, the Holocaust was a raison d'être, and Israel's President David Ben-Gurion understood very soon that a trial against Eichmann could achieve a number of goals if conducted in Israel. First, Jews should no longer be regarded as victims, but as a strong people willing to act, that they and nobody else should prosecute the person who had wanted their death. Further, Eichmann's trial and review of the crimes of the Holocaust could justify quite openly the founding of the Israeli state in 1948. Finally, it could serve as a tool to bring the Israeli people together. Israel had constituted itself as a place for immigrants from many countries and cultures who tried to forge a common identity. Most of the Israeli citizens did not speak Hebrew as their mother tongue. Any trial had to be conducted in modern Hebrew, he deemed, the new language that should be spoken by all. But there were also tensions between different parts of the population, cultural differences between immigrants from Western and Eastern Europe, European Jews and those from Asia, the Maghreb, Ashkenazi and Sephardim. The Eichmann trial, therefore, was supposed to take place in Jerusalem and in Hebrew. It took place in 1961 in a temporary court building. But the trial that was also defined by the media. It was filmed, but Israel had no television station yet. Nearly every Israeli at the time had a radio, however. Every day, excerpts from the trial could be heard, and several times there were live broadcasts as well. Israelis who were listening to the broadcast could not only hear the voices of the lawyers or Eichmann's voice. The Eichmann trial was also, and perhaps most of all, a trial that featured witnesses, where survivors took the stand. Week after week, the prosecuting attorney was asking survivors questions and urging them to speak about their experiences in the Third Reich. Border had recorded the voices of survivors already in 1946, meeting with Jews in displaced person camps and elsewhere. But at the time of the Eichmann trial, his tapes were still stored in an archive and difficult to access. The first great post-war trial of prominent Nazi leaders was conducted by the Allies in 1946 in Nuremberg. It would establish the term crimes against humanities. But the Nuremberg trials did not focus exclusively on the persecution of Jews, and there films were witnesses. Eichmann was still at large. The court would show films made by Allied soldiers as evidence of the crimes, and no survivors were hurt. The Eichmann trial proceeded differently. On the one hand, Eichmann's activities were reconstructed, and Eichmann was questioned in regard to his motives. But the court approved a long list of witnesses that, as well, all survivors of the camps. These survivors took a stand in court now, and for the first time their voices could be heard publicly, either in court itself or on the radio. Thus, the Eichmann trial assumed a double status. On the one hand, it was a court trial against one of the leading figures authorizing Nazi genocide. On the other hand, the Eichmann trial was a precursor of the taped survivor interviews recorded by the Fortunow or Show Visual History Archives, and perhaps even of Lanzmann's Shoah. In the context of this trial, a great number of survivors would, for the first time, raise their voices, tell their stories, answer questions, and still serve officially as testies in a juridical setting. But what exactly could they testify? Not all witnesses had a direct or even indirect relationships to Eichmann or knew about his role in the Nazi bureaucracy. Instead, they would tell about themselves, their families, their losses. Hannah Arendt, who attended the Eichmann trial in its first weeks as a reporter for the journal The New Yorker, took issue with a great number of witnesses called. More than 100 survivors were heard, and 62 of the 121 court sessions were dedicated to their testimony only. Some witnesses said quite clearly that they could not say anything about Eichmann at all, and they were still invited to speak. The answers to the court's questions were often incongruous, and at times they took on a life of their own. Arendt's much-discussed essay about the trial, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, appeared in 1963. And there Arendt discussed the status of witnesses at the trial at length, focusing in particular on the statement of Yehiel Feiner, who would call himself Yehiel Denur in Israel, but insisted to give his statement under the name Katzetnik 135633, the number of his concentration camp tattoo that he has used as his author's name for his memoirs of the war as well. Arendt describes his witness statement as a theatrical performance. I quote Hannah Arendt. He started off, as he had done at as many public appearances, with an explanation of his adopted name. It was not a pen name, he said. I must carry this name as long as the world will not awaken after the crucifying of a nation, as humanity has risen after the crucifixion of one man. He continued with a little excursion into astrology, the star influencing our fate in the same way as the star of ashes at Auschwitz is there facing our planet, radiating toward our planet. And when he arrived at the unnatural power above nature, which has sustained him thus far, and now for the first time paused to catch his breath, even Mr. Hausner felt that something has to be done about this kind of testimony. And very timidly, very politely, he interrupted, "Could I perhaps put a few questions to you, if you will consent?" Whereupon the presiding judge saw his chance as well, Mr. Dinor, please, listen to Mr. Hausner and to me. In response, the disappointed witness, probably deeply wounded, fainted and answered no more questions. In her rendering of the event, Arendt agrees with the Israeli prosecuting attorney Gideon Hausner, whom she would criticize quite strongly elsewhere. And surely Katzetnik's testimony must have been quite unique, as was the fainting spell. But was this fainting really the result of being irritated or insulted by Hausner's prodding, as Arendt seems to indicate? Or was it perhaps the result of fear and the reaction of a traumatized who was called to court to make a public statement? Other witness accounts, too, did not offer clear accounts of past events, but ventured into biographical excursions. The trial's minutes document all this. In an article in the bulletin of the then new Jerusalem memorial site established for the victims of the Holocaust, Yad Vashem summarized the witness testimonies at the end of the Eichmann trial in proposing a totally and perhaps very unusual conclusion. I quote, "It was the right of witnesses," it declared, "not to speak to the point." The witnesses may not have always spoken to the point and kept to the topic, but their presence and their many voices were important and produced the desired political effect. Thus, the Israeli historian Liora Bilski points at the great importance of the Eichmann trial for the formation of an Israeli national identity. The seemingly endless line of witnesses, and not the trial's final judgment, may have provoked this result. But there was another after effect of the Eichmann trial as well. Many survivors who were now living in Israel and followed the court proceedings on the radio were encouraged to break their silence and talk about the past. They were now ready for conversations between family members or acquaintances and to answer questions themselves. In this sense, the Eichmann trial had a therapeutical effect. For the general Israeli public, Katzetnik's fainting spell in particular would trigger the beginning of a national working out of the horrors of the past. Coda. In the Federal Republic of Germany, a law forbids the denial of the Holocaust. But the British historian David Irving has not been so sure that the mass murder of Jews really happened, even today. In his popular study of Hitler's war that appeared in 1977 in England, Irving would indeed describe Hitler as an anti-Semitic ideologue, but his convictions regarding Jews would not have led to the consequence of mass murder. After 1988, Irving formulated his doubts about the very existence of death camp and mass murder of the Jews more clearly. It would be unscientific, Irving claimed, to assume the murder of Jews in gas chambers, as there were no witnesses really to testify. Irving, who owned a publishing house in England, published a report by the American author Fred Leuchter about Auschwitz that argued that there was no real evidence for a final solution at all. This, in turn, led the American historian Deborah Lipstadt to describe Irving as a Holocaust denier, and indeed as one of the most dangerous scholars who deny the Holocaust in print. Irving struck back, and in 1996 he sued Lipstadt and the English publisher Penguin for libel. 4 years later, the case was heard in court. In a German or American legal system, the accused is found to be innocent, unless proven otherwise. The English system, however, is different. Lipstadt was to be regarded as guilty until her innocence could be proven. In this particular case, Lipstadt could prove the truth of her claim only by offering evidence that Auschwitz had been a death camp, and that Irving's writings rejected this fact in favor for ideologically colored statements. But what happened in Auschwitz really? The minutes of the court case, as well as later books that dealt with the case, authored by Lipstadt as well as her English lawyer Anthony Julius, show the difficulties that the legal team had to make evidence readable in court. In this context, Julius made an interesting decision. He decided not to call on any former Auschwitz inmates and refrained from hearing survivors as witnesses at all. In doing this, Julius's defense strategy was to differ between testis, that means a witness who could offer factual evidence, in this case a historian or an architect, and superstis, those who perhaps did not remember clearly and could not speak with a unified voice. Witnesses whose memories varied or whose testimonies showed narrative gaps would seem vulnerable. Once all former campmates were excluded, only the so-called experts would speak. Their voices would be heard, documents and material gathered. Only people who had not been to Auschwitz could make a case for its existence as a death camp that would convince a judge. The strategy worked, and Lipstadt won. The international press followed the trial with great interest, and for a Hollywood film producer, it even had the material of a thriller. Under the title Denial, with a book by David Hare and directed by Mick Jackson, the film had its premiere in 2016. The Eichmann trial had already shown the political consequences of having survivors speak. The Irving Lipstadt trial took place without these witnesses. At the London court, many survivors were present, but they took their places as observers only in the public gallery. And there, once again, the audience could view them as simple images only. Thank you.